Medical professionals are some of the hardest working and most trustworthy people on the planet. But the doctor in today's story is going to have you questioning just how much you know and trust your family doctor. The lengths this doctor went through to conceal his crimes he committed against his patients is something you would only expect to find in the movies. So make sure to stick around to the end to find out the shocking truth of what actually happened. And be sure to keep watch throughout the video, because if you find the secret hidden in the background and you are the first person to post the time and location in the comments below, then I will pin your comment to the top. And of course, if you enjoy creepy stories, then make sure to like, subscribe, and click all of the notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into it. There is a town in the Canadian prairies known as Kipling, Saskatchewan. It is a place where everyone knows everyone, and it is an extremely tight-knit community where generations of families have been raised over the decades. Candace was just finishing up her shift at the local convenience store one late October night in 1992. She had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Danny, who had stopped by the store to see her that evening. But while he was there, they got into an argument that escalated until Candace became so upset that she just threw her hands in the air and got in her car and sped off, leaving Danny standing in the parking lot staring after her as she drove away. Candace was so riled up from the argument that she was having trouble concentrating on anything else. She needed to cool off, so she steered her car towards the Kipling Memorial Hospital to visit one of her friends that worked there. But when she got there, she found that her friend had actually gotten off work a bit early. Candace was about to turn and leave when the nurses sitting over at the nursing station noticed how distraught she was. So quickly, they went over to Candace and gently guided her into an examination room where they insisted that she see Dr. Schneeberger before leaving. Dr. Schneeberger was originally from South Africa, but had moved to Canada a few years earlier, and over the years he had earned the reputation as a well-respected member of the community. Dr. Schneeberger had also been the doctor that delivered Candace's daughter earlier that same year, and so Candace was already comfortable with him when she proceeded to tell him about her anxiety that was precipitated by the fight she had gotten into with her ex-boyfriend. Dr. Schneeberger sat and listened intently to Candace, gently making sure she was okay, and then he recommended to her that she take a sedative. He then got up and left the room to go and get it. She was expecting him to offer her a pill to calm her nerves, but instead, he returned to the examination room with a syringe. The doctor took her by the arm as she held it out for him, and he very calmly inserted the needle and then administered the sedative into Candace's arm. Immediately after she received the shot, she knew something wasn't right. Candace lost all control of her body, admitting later that she fell over like a piece of jelly and that she tried to scream as she fell, but the only noise she could manage to get out was a rough, scratchy, croaking sound. The sedative that the doctor had given her had rendered her partially unconscious. But between the waves of consciousness and unconsciousness, she still managed to remain aware of what was going on, and she knew, at that moment, she was being laid down on her side on the bed with her face towards the wall, and then to her horror, she was being assaulted inside the hospital by Dr. Schneeberger, and there was nothing she could do about it. Absolutely nothing. Eventually, Candace completely blacked out. When she finally woke up, she looked around trying to gain her bearings, and she realized that she had spent the night in the hospital. She knew something was very, very wrong, and when Dr. Schneeberger came into her room, she confronted him about how he had drugged and attacked her, but the doctor wasn't fazed by her accusations, even giggling a little. He told her with a dismissive hand gesture that the medication causes crazy dreams and she shouldn't worry about it because what she was talking about was all in her head. But Candace knew she had been assaulted, and knowing that she wasn't going to let him get away with it, she climbed out of the hospital bed and walked to the nursing station where she asked one of the nurses on duty for a plastic bag. And into this bag she placed her underwear, and then she drove home. The next morning, Candace knew she had a busy day ahead of her as she drove to the city of Regina, which was about 2-hour drive away from Kipling, and eventually she came to a stop at a clinic where Candace would have them perform a series of tests and collect a number of samples from her body to determine if a sexual assault had occurred. She also handed them the bag containing her underwear along with her jeans. And, unsurprisingly to Candace, the results of the tests came back positive. This information 100% confirmed to Candace that she had not been hallucinating and that she had been assaulted by Dr. Schneeberger. Candace had no doubt at all about it. The blood test that had been performed confirmed that the name of the drug that the doctor had given her was called Versed, which was a pre-anesthetic used to induce anesthesia and is used for procedures like colonoscopies. Armed with this information, Candace drove the 2 hours back to Kipling and came to a stop at the Kipling Police Department, where she went inside and filed a formal complaint against Dr. Schneeberger. 2 days later, on November 2nd, without hesitation, Dr. Schneeberger volunteered to give a sample of his blood. He was totally confident that the DNA test would clear him of all suspicions regarding Candace's allegations against him. And so, he rolled up his sleeve and the blood was drawn and sent for testing. When the results came back as a negative match to the samples taken from Candace's assault kit, she couldn't believe it. She believed with every fiber of her being that this was completely and totally impossible. There had to be a mistake, and so she spent the next year insisting to the police that the DNA had been tampered with. But unfortunately, she had no way to prove it. But that didn't stop Candace from pushing the matter. She was very, very vocal about what had happened to her, and so finally, after almost a year of pressure, Dr. Schneeberger agreed to a second voluntary DNA test. This time, the test was done by a registered nurse, and the procedure was monitored by the police. They watched the needle enter his arm, and the vials of blood were taken directly to the police headquarters. And again, the second test did not match the DNA sample from Candace's assault kit. Candace could not believe it. She just couldn't. Regardless of what the testing said, she believed so strongly that Dr. Schneeberger had assaulted her. She was completely devastated by the test results. Eventually, Candace moved 9 hours away into the neighboring province of Alberta to the city of Red Deer in order to escape the harsh treatment she was receiving from the people in her hometown, because the people of Kipling now believed that Candace was a liar. And satisfied with the 2 negative DNA tests, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP for short, closed the case in 1994, and Dr. Schneeberger continued with his practice, doing his best to get on with his life. But in 1995, Candace was still reeling with disbelief that the DNA test didn't match, and she wasn't going to let it go. She was willing to do just about anything to get to the bottom of it, so she hired a private investigator named Larry O'Brien. O'Brien was a veteran of the RCMP and had done undercover work during his career, and for his first task, Candace sent him off to get another sample of Dr. Schneeberger's DNA by any means possible. On March 3rd, 1996, it had been 4 years since Candace's incident in the hospital. O'Brien broke into Dr. Schneeberger's car and began gathering up anything that could potentially provide a DNA sample. During his rummaging around the car, he found a tube of chapstick and sealed it inside an evidence bag. He then wrote the time and date on the sample and shipped it off to an independent forensics lab in the neighboring province of British Columbia. When the results came back, Candace almost hit the floor because they showed that the DNA sample from the chapstick matched the DNA found on Candace's underwear all those years ago, proving that Candace was correct all along. The only problem was that the DNA had been obtained without a warrant, and so the police couldn't use it as evidence. And there was also no proof that the chapstick was Dr. Schneeberger's. So, because of this, police did not reopen the case. But that didn't mean that the police weren't curious about it. Candace was still completely baffled as to why the DNA from his arm did not match the DNA from the underwear and the chapstick, so she filed a civil suit against Dr. Schneeberger. And as he had done before, Dr. Schneeberger again volunteered to have his blood taken a third time for another DNA test. This time, to ensure the integrity of the test, the procedure was performed in the police forensics lab and recorded on video. Lab technicians didn't need a lot of blood to conduct a DNA test. A simple pinprick of the finger is more than sufficient, but Dr. Schneeberger claimed that he had a condition that caused him to bruise easily on his hands, and so to avoid this bruising, he requested that they take a sample from his left arm. And since this was a voluntary test, and he was giving the sample in good faith, the police complied with his request. So, Dr. Schneeberger rolled up his sleeve and the technician inserted the needle into his vein for the third time. But this time, the technician noticed that the vein was a little bit unusual, in that it appeared larger than what would have been normally expected. She also found it a bit difficult to extract the blood, but eventually she was able to get a sample. However, she noticed that the blood looked a little strange, sort of like it wasn't really fresh. The lab attempted to test the blood anyway, but they eventually determined that because of the quality of the blood, it wasn't a large enough sample, and the blood somehow had been too degraded for an accurate DNA test. And so the third DNA test ended with no answers, and Candace was furious, blaming the lab for screwing everything up because she believed that this was her last chance to have the testing done. However, just 5 months later, a call into the Kipling police station would turn Candace's story into front-page headlines, but unfortunately, it would come at a massive cost to another innocent person. On the evening of April 25th, 1997, Dr. Schneeberger's wife, Lisa, contacted the police and accused her husband of assaulting her 13-year-old daughter. Lisa's daughter was Dr. Schneeberger's stepdaughter as a result of his marriage to Lisa. She told her mother that for years, her stepfather, Dr. Schneeberger, had been coming into her room in the middle of the night, and then he would inject her with something that would leave her fleeting memories of unwanted sexual contact. Lisa was absolutely shocked and totally disgusted at the thought that her husband could actually be doing something like this to her daughter. So she set off and searched throughout the entire house for some type of evidence, and eventually she found a box hidden away in her husband's home office. And when she opened it up, she found syringes and the same drug that had been used on Candace. And then, as she came to realize that the horrible story was probably true, she turned away from the box and called the police. Dr. Schneeberger was immediately arrested and ordered under a warrant this time to do a DNA test. This would be the fourth DNA test, and this time the test was no longer voluntary, and because of that, the technician took 3 DNA samples. One from his hair, the second was a saliva swab taken from his mouth, and the third was a blood sample from his finger on his right hand instead of his left arm, where all 3 previous tests had been taken. And to the shock of everyone, all 3 samples matched the DNA from the chapstick found in his car and from the semen on Candace's underwear. It wouldn't be until November 1999 before the world found out how Dr. Schneeberger had evaded the charges for the past 7 years. Dr. Schneeberger took the witness stand in his own defense and told the court that the first 3 times that his blood had been drawn, the technician had actually drawn someone else's blood, even though the needle was in his own arm. 7 years earlier, Dr. Schneeberger had taken blood from one of his male patients and then injected it into a thin rubber tube called a Penrose drain, along with an anticoagulant meant to keep it in a liquid state and prevent it from drying out or clogging up. And then he implanted the tube in his own arm just beside his own vein. This explained why, on the 3rd blood sample so many years ago, the technician thought the blood looked darker than what would be normal, like it wasn't fresh. And that's because it wasn't. Dr. Schneeberger had removed this tube from his arm after the second test and stored it in a refrigerator just in case he might need it again. And then, when it came time to give more blood for another DNA test 4 years later, he simply just cut his arm open, inserted the tube, and sewed it back in. Even after this huge revelation, Dr. Schneeberger still claimed that Candace's story was a lie, and that the reason he put the tube in his arm was because it was the only way he could defend himself. In the end, Dr. Schneeberger was convicted of 2 counts of indecent assault, 1 count of administering a noxious substance to commit an indictable offense, and 1 count of obstructing justice. He only served 4 years of his 6-year sentence. He was stripped of his medical license, as well as his Canadian citizenship, and he was deported back to South Africa. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you haven't already, please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our Creepyville stories. And if you found the secret in today's background, remember to post the time and location in the comments below, and the first person to get it right will be pinned to the top of the comments. And if you have any story suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. And I will see you again later.